Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, when a door closes, dozens of white South Africans arrive in Washington despite the Trump administration's refugee crackdown elsewhere, as it claims that they're actually fleeing for their lives. The justification of the resettlers' US welcome still sparks widespread confusion and some ridicule. Also, no more abductions, says Kenya's president, as he assures those horrified by a wave of disappearances linked to last year's fatal anti-government protests that the victims, who were held extrajudicially, have been returned. Calls, though, for accountability continue. And ant smugglers get hit with big fines in Kenya, 7,000 euros each or a year in prison for attempting to sneak in over 5,000 giant harvester ant queens, valued at about 200 euros each. But first, about 49 white South Africans arrived in the US on Monday after having been given refugee status by the Trump administration, even as it gets the pitchforks out for refugees from most other places. In a characterization that has been widely dismissed as being well off the mark, Washington has said that they are genocide victims facing persecution at home due to a recent land expropriation act and historic farm attacks. Now, the matter's drawn a mixture of ridicule and shock in South Africa, where President Cyril Ramaphosa said that the US has got the wrong end of the stick, but they will continue talking to them. Tom Canetti brings us more from Cape Town.
So these 49 Afrikaners really only represent a very small portion of the population here. In February, we actually travelled to Pretoria to talk to some of these disgruntled Afrikaner farmers at a pro-Trump rally. So these are some of the most vocal critics of the South African government. They told us that they were frustrated with this expropriation act, and they said that the government was not taking action against farm attacks. But even these people, the vast majority of them, told us that they would not accept refugee status in the US, and they would rather, in their own words, have things fixed in South Africa. Critics of the Trump administration say this is purely political and punishment towards South Africa for taking Israel to the ICJ. The Trump administration has repeatedly asked South Africa to withdraw that case, to which it has refused. Local South Africans, many are calling these people traitors, considering South Africa's history, and saying that these people are spinning lies about the reality here in a country where black people face much higher levels of unemployment and poverty.
There is no persecution of white Afrikaner South Africans in South Africa. This has been proven by a number of statistics in our country, including the police reports, which don't back that assertion of persecution of white South Africans on the basis of their race. The crime that we have in South Africa affects everyone, irrespective of race and irrespective of gender.
Some are actually questioning the legality of whether these so-called refugees should be allowed to return to the country, considering the fact that to be accepted as a refugee, one must prove that they're being persecuted in their home country. So questions around the legality of their return in the future, even to visit for a holiday, for example.
Tom talking us through there. Now, several dozen soldiers and civilians were reportedly killed in simultaneous extremist attacks in northern Burkina Faso over the weekend. The raids targeted military and police posts around the border town of Djibu on Sunday. Now, the country's been struggling to rein in the mounting threat posed by armed groups over the last 3 years or so. Meanwhile, over in Kenya, President William Ruto says that there are no more missing Kenyans and that the dozens of abduction cases linked to deadly anti-protests have been wrapped up. Now, the disappearance of young critics of the establishment sparked international concern when they started happening last year. Olivia Bizo tells us more.
The announcement came on Monday during a press briefing at State House with visiting Finnish President Alexander Stubb. Kenyan President William Ruto said that all Kenyans who disappeared under suspicious circumstances have now been reunited with their families. And he insisted it will not happen again. He pointed to what he called a major reform, giving the police financial and operational independence as a way of preventing future disappearances. But crucial questions remain unanswered. Ruto did not name who was behind the abductions, and there's still no official explanation for how so many people vanished. They were often taken by hooded men in unmarked cars, and they were sometimes held for days or even weeks with no charges ever laid. Now, the president's remarks follow a recent report by the watchdog group Missing Voices, which documented at least 55 enforced disappearances in 2024. Many of those occurred during last year's anti-government protests, and they triggered nationwide alarm and global attention. So Ruto now says the matter is resolved, but rights groups say that without accountability and full transparency, the fear continues. Because for many families, the real question is not whether their loved ones came home, but why they were taken in the first place and who will be held responsible.
Olivia there for us. Well, staying with Kenya, a court recently fined 4 men almost 7,000 euros each, or sentenced them to a year in prison for attempting to sneak in over 5,400 giant African harvester ant queens. Each is valued at around 200 euros. The group, which consisted of 2 Belgian teenagers, a Vietnamese man and a Kenyan national, was arrested early last month and had faced up to 5 years in prison. In a case experts say marks a shift in biopiracy. Olivia's back with more.
4 suspects caught with more than 5,000 queen ants. They claim to be insect collectors, but the ants could fetch up to 800,000 euros on the black market.
There is no justification for being found with 5,000 queen ants. None at all. This is beyond a hobby. If it happened to any larger species, with 5,000 of a specific gender being taken away, it would be genocidal proportions.
Wildlife trafficking is shifting from big game to smaller species. Sub-Romarian studies insect populations. He says moving ants across borders can disrupt ecosystems and cause lasting damage.
When this ant or any other insect moves from its original location to another location, the natural enemy that has been controlling these insects are not moving with the insect. So in a situation where they get into the wild, they can become as a major pest, and this is what we call as invasive species. And in most occasions, these invasive species are catastrophic.
On the other side of Nairobi, Steve collects butterflies. Okay. He's recorded 200 of Kenya's 900 species.
You can get 25, 30 butterflies or more in a trap like this.
Some are worth thousands, but he insists their true value can't be measured in money.
It can have a monetary value from a community perspective, but most important is we need to learn in Africa and the developing world the importance of saving our biodiversity, which has been largely destroyed in Europe and America.
These tiny insects point to a larger problem: law enforcement of trade regulations.
Well, on Monday, tributes continued to pour in from the global art community to groundbreaking Swiss-Cameroonian curator Koyo Kouoh. Now, there's been shock ever since her death was announced in an Instagram post over the weekend. It followed a recent cancer diagnosis. She was just 58 and was poised to become the first African woman to lead the 2026 Venice Biennale. Now, organisers of that cultural mainstay have said that her passing has left an immense void in the world of contemporary art. Kouoh was enormously respected on the continent and beyond. Meanwhile, Burundi's official election campaign kicked off at the start of the week. Voters first head to the polls on June 5th, but the run-up to that exercise is already a fraught one, despite authorities' insistence that all is well. Juliette Montilly talks us through.
Burundians are set to vote on June 5th to choose their next lawmakers and local council representatives. The campaign officially kicked off on Monday after a highly choreographed event last week before President Evariste Ndayishimiye. The ceremony, designed like a sporting event, aimed to showcase an image of democratic competition. In his speech, the president made much of reminding civil servants of their duty to remain important partial. But many observers still believe this display of political pluralism is more illusion than reality. The candidacy of the main opposition figure, Agathon Rwasa, was rejected by the Electoral Commission, and the ruling CNDD-FDD party is widely expected to win an election in which it faces no real challenge. Campaign season begins in a tense atmosphere. Over the last few weeks, clashes, particularly between rival youth party groups, have broken out across several regions, stirring memories of the deadly violence of the 2020 vote. Meanwhile, a nationwide fuel shortage is complicating logistics, and without any independent observers, critics fear transparency will be hard to guarantee.
Well, we turn now to Mauritania, where the camel cavalry plays a really big role in the country's security. The Meharistes patrol hundreds of kilometers, strengthening community links along the way. A strategy that does seem to be bearing fruit, as Mauritania has not seen an extremist attack for a while now. Clemens Vella tells us more.
On the backs of their camels, these Mauritanian soldiers patrol the border. Objective: to fight jihadist groups and act as a relay point between the state and the Bedouin populations.
We patrol, we look out for enemies, and we fight bandits.
Taking up the mantle of units created under French colonial rule, the Meharists were threatened with extinction just a few years ago. But since 2019, millions of euros of EU investment in the region have enabled the group to be maintained in the fight against terrorism. The number of camel cavalry members has risen from 50 to 150, with a herd of 400 camels. They play an important role in the security strategy of the country, which borders Mali, who is embroiled in jihadist violence.
The nomadic group has become increasingly important with the threat of terrorism. We also need to keep an eye on these nomadic populations so that they don't tip over the edge, so that they aren't recruited by terrorists, as is the case in some countries for intelligence, supplies and recruitment purposes.
Since 2011, Mauritania has not suffered any jihadist attacks, making it stand out from its Sahelian neighbors. To achieve this, Nouakchott has focused on a multi-pronged approach, strengthening its armed forces, mobilizing imams as part of a de-radicalization program, and also calling for development projects to invest in the country's infrastructure.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now, but thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Till then, take care.